I wanted to start with a quotation, a definition of Puritanism by the writer H.L. Mencken. And it goes like this: Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. Now, I'm no Puritan, and in fact, I'm on a mission, which is why it's so nice to be here. So I want to start with what I suppose is the most important question one could possibly ask. What should be our basic purpose in the way that we live our lives? And closely related to that, since we're social animals, what kind of society would one most want to live in? Now, I'm an economist, and you know what my colleagues, many of them, would say about that. They'd say the best thing we can do is to have a society that's as rich as possible. I completely disagree with that. I think we want a society in which people are enjoying their lives the most, where there's the most happiness, and of course especially the least possible misery. So you've got two visions there. Which of them is best? Well, here's an extraordinary fact. In the United States, there has been massive increase in income and wealth in all sections of the community since 1950. And what has happened to happiness? Flat. No change. Similar results on the evidence for Britain and many other countries. So this is a huge challenge to economists, isn't it? I experience it as a challenge, and it's what brought me into this subject. But it's a huge challenge to anybody, politician or anybody else, who is claiming that the right objective for our society is to simply become richer and richer, and that will solve all our problems. So suppose that you accept my opinion that the best thing we should do is to create a society with the most happiness and the least misery. How would we go about it? Well, it would require, wouldn't it, that every one of us, you, me, everybody in the society, did in their own way attempt, as far as they could, to create as much happiness in the world as they could and as little misery. That really is what is required. So I think that's the answer to my original question. What should be the purpose of our lives? Purpose should be to try and create as much happiness in the world as we can and as little misery. I find that a really inspiring ideal, not easy to live up to. I don't know how many of you think like that, but I hope that maybe by the time we've finished, I will have persuaded you. So I suppose the first question you might ask me is, well, what do you mean by happiness? By happiness, I mean feeling good about your life, wanting to go on that way. And by unhappiness, I mean feeling bad about your life and wanting things to be different. We can measure how happy people are. We can ask them that question. Now, you might say, do their answers mean anything? We know that, yes, they do, because here's another extraordinary fact, which is that if you measure the electrical activity in the relevant areas of the brain, those are objective measurements, you will find that they are well correlated with people's answers to questions about how happy they are. So that's what persuaded me, that we really can know about happiness. It's something we really can get to understand, get to grips with, and thereby we can, of course, increase it. Now, fortunately, all over the world, there are more and more people who are taking happiness seriously and are saying, no, what we want is a society which is happier, not just richer. In Britain, we've got leading politicians in all our parties who are saying that and thinking that way. Our government has, for the last 2 years, been measuring the happiness of the population using measures which we suggested for them. And the OECD, the Club of Rich Nations, is now asking all countries to take standard measurements on the happiness of their population. That is really important because it's the OECD that started the measurement of the GDP 60 years ago, which of course you read about in the papers, and some people think is the answer, and I'm saying is not the answer. So it's great to have the OECD on our side. And the UN, too, has just held a recent massive conference on happiness, where some of us produced the first World Happiness Report. So there's a lot of interest and support for this idea worldwide, growing every year. But why? Well, I think there are two things. One is the disillusionment with economic growth, that it didn't bring the nirvana that people expected. That's the one thing, the fact one that I mentioned. But the other thing, of course, is that we now know so much more about happiness, the new science of happiness, so that we now have really quite a good account of what things cause happiness and misery, what things are more important than which others. And that's what I want to talk about today, the causes of happiness, and then obviously from that, the implications about how we should lead our lives. Okay, so how does this science of happiness work? Well, if you looked around this room, you would find an extraordinary variation in the amount of happiness in different people in this room. And the same thing is true, of course, in the whole population. We know now from these surveys that there's a huge variety in the levels of happiness in the population. So what are the most important things which explain that variety? What are the main causes? Well, obviously there are external causes, things in our situation, and there are things inside ourselves. On the external side, what would you think is the most important cause? Well, of course, my colleagues, or some of them, would say the person's income. But what fraction of the variation of happiness do you think is accounted for by the variation in income? Well, this is pretty amazing. In Britain, it's under 1% of the variation in happiness is due to the variation in income. And I think there's no country in the world where it's as much as 2%. So actually, in every country in the world, the main external factor determining our happiness is the quality of our human relationships. In every country, the most important ones are the close personal ones. Then there's work. Work is, of course, a relationship. So that if you become unemployed, these surveys show that it causes as much pain as if your spouse dies. But of course, even if you have a job, the relationships at work are important. What do you think is the most miserable time on average for a person during the day? It's time spent with the boss. I mean, this is a terrible reflection, isn't it, on management and some of the excessively macho management philosophies in our society. But then, of course, also, not just personal, but work, but relationships in the community matter, our neighbors, people in the street, on the buses, in the shops. So here's a very interesting question. This has been asked in many countries over many years. Do you think, listen hard, do you think that most other people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful? Now, maybe we could have a vote. I can hardly see you, but we could have a vote. It would be interesting. Who thinks that most other people can be trusted? Raise. Who thinks most other people can't be trusted? Well, you see, this is fascinating. It shows what lovely people you are, or it shows what sheltered lives you have. I'll tell you the answer. For our population in Britain today, the proportion who think that most other people can be trusted is 30%. And the same is true in America. And that is particularly depressing because it used to be 60%. Half a century ago in both Britain and America, it was 60%. That has collapsed. That's a profound cultural change. I think it's due to a much more individualistic culture, much more stress on competition relative to cooperation, and thus much more of a feeling that other people are just a bit of a threat to you. Interestingly, there are some countries in which it's well over 60% still. Guess which? Well, Scandinavian countries. You probably did guess. These are countries which put more emphasis on cooperation and more emphasis on mutual respect, and that's why they have higher levels of trust. So our external situation, of course, matters for our happiness. But happiness comes from within as well as from without. And what's inside us is extraordinarily important. So what's there? Well, obviously the genes are there, but nothing we can do about them. There's our philosophy of life, which I want to come back to. And then there's our health. Now, in all these surveys, it's found that mental health problems cause more of the misery in our society than physical illness. That's found in many countries, and I think it's extraordinarily important. You probably all know somebody who has a mental health problem. It's very pervasive and common. 1 in 5 of adults would be diagnosed as having a mental illness. The really shocking thing is that only a quarter of them are in treatment in most advanced countries, as compared, of course, with most people who have physical illnesses who are in treatment. We used to have a Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain called Nigel Lawson, and he was visiting an old people's home once, and he was talking to a lady, and he said, "Oh, by the way, do you know who I am?" And she replied, "No, dear, but I'm sure if you asked the nurse, she could tell you." So dementia is one problem, but by far the biggest problems of mental illness are either depression or anxiety disorders like panic attacks, OCD, PTSD, and so on. The really good news is that we have effective psychological treatments which will help at least half of people to recover in less than 16 sessions of treatment. And that is a real step forward. I spend an awful lot of my time trying to help our national program for delivering these therapies to people who need them to be expanded to the level necessary. We've still got a way to go, but this is something actually which is being looked at. Our program is being looked at from all over the world as a possible example to follow, because this is a problem, worldwide problem. I just want to mention one other point about our inner selves. Obviously, our childhood plays a massive role in determining our personality. And if you ask which factors about childhood are the best predictors of whether an adult will be someone who is satisfied with their lives, I wonder what you think is most important. If we just take 3 aspects of childhood, the academic development and achievement of a child, the social behavior of a child, and the emotional health of a child, which of those would be most likely have the biggest influence in predicting whether the person would become a satisfied adult? Well, you probably know already what the answer is. The emotional health is the best predictor, and I'm sorry to say that the academic performance is the worst predictor. Sorry about that. So that's a sort of thumbnail sketch of the causes of happiness and misery. So taking that into account, I suppose it's not so difficult to understand why happiness has been flat the way it has. You've had income up, that's a positive feature, I do believe that. But you've had more family attention, you've had more work stress, you've had a fall in trust, and you've had an increase in mental illness, particularly among young people, and I think that's particularly associated with this very competitive ethos which has developed in our culture, where people are all the time comparing themselves with other people. I mean, I think it's obvious, this is a logical point I'm going to make, it's obvious that if your happiness depends entirely on how you compare with other people, there's no way the society can become happier, because if somebody rises relative to other people, somebody else has to go down. That is what we call in our jargon the zero-sum game. We've absolutely got to get away from this excessively competitive ethos if we want to move from that flat plane onto a higher plateau of happiness. I firmly believe, that's what I really am in this for, I firmly believe we can move on to a higher plateau of happiness just using some of the knowledge I've already deployed. So let's very quickly go through what government could do and then what we could do. Government obviously should be providing proper mental health services to people who need it. They should be ensuring that the schools are developing character and resilience and not just academic competence. We can't have just exam factories. We have to give much more support to parents in conflict with each other, a real national problem, domestic violence, and of course, we have to keep unemployment low and not take risks with it in the name of faster long-term economic growth. So the state has got a major role, particularly in the reduction and prevention of misery. But an awful lot of the work, of course, has got to be done by all of us. So what do we have to do? Well, I think there are two main areas, as it were, our inner strength and our outer relations with other people. I don't know how many of you have read the great book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. He was an Auschwitz survivor, and this is why he says he survived Auschwitz. Because of man's, this is a quote, man's ultimate freedom to choose your attitude in any set of circumstances. To choose your attitude in any set of circumstances. You have to develop a strong inner core where you're able to relate to whatever the positive features are in your life. You have to develop a strong, safe place you can withdraw to if necessary, whatever is happening and whatever has happened. And there are many ways to do this. I know some of you here do meditation, others practice positive psychology. But one way or another, you have to develop your own inner strength. And then you also have to, of course, get more of your happiness from helping other people. That's good for the other people, obviously. But what neuroscience is now showing us is it's also good for you. Because to an important extent, virtue is its own reward. If you help other people, your brain does light up in the standard reward centers where it lights up from other kinds of reward. So there is hope. If that weren't so, I don't think it would be worth all this preaching I'm doing. It's because you can get a payoff from living better that there's some hope in the world that we could get people to live better. So what we need is really a complete cultural change, away from self-absorption to a world where people have more inner strength and are more caring to each other. And that's why we founded this movement called Action for Happiness. I'm going to put up the flag. Action for Happiness. This is a movement which we hope will become worldwide to promote the kind of ideas that I've been talking about today. So the first thing, if you join, is that you make a pledge, and of course it's the pledge I was talking about at the beginning, that we should try to create as much happiness as we can in the world and as little misery. And then there's a wonderful website that you can find there, which gives you the evidence about how that can be done, suggestions about how it can be done, which include our 10 keys to happier living. And then, increasingly, we've got 30,000 members so far in the first 3 years. Increasingly, members are getting together in universities or in places where they live or work to support each other. Because, of course, it's not easy to lead a good life without support from fellow souls who have the same objectives as you do yourself. Now, to make it easy for groups to get started, we have on our website what we call Exploring What Matters. This is materials, videos, written materials, topics for discussion, and so on, for 8 sessions, which cover the kind of issues that we've been talking about today. So I'm hoping that some of you here will go into our site, form a group of like-minded people, work through these topics, and then carry it forward in whatever way makes sense to you. So we think that this could become a worldwide movement that made an important contribution to creating a better world. When we started it, of course, we had to have a director, and we interviewed many candidates, and one of them had gone into the web to see if there was any other organization which had got the word happiness in its title. Interesting question. And this is what came back on his screen. Your search for happiness has produced no results. Well, I think we can do better than that. And I hope we'll all do better than that. And I hope you'll all join our movement. Thank you very much.